August 17, 1945, 10:45 a.m., Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Japanese soldiers stacked rifles in silence as U.S. sailors guided them toward transport ships. Word rippled through the ranks. Some would be sent to prison camps in America, a fate whispered about with dread. Many whispered that starvation awaited them. They had heard of bread lines and ration cards across the Pacific. But their surrender carried an irony they could not yet grasp. They were about to eat better than most of their own families at home, with meals richer in meat and fruit than they had ever known. A Japanese petty officer told comrades in 1945, "In America, even prisoners will die of hunger." The line, scribbled years later in a post-war memoir, captured the mindset of men who boarded transport ships believing captivity meant famine. In the closing months of the Pacific War, rumor carried more weight than rations. Japanese soldiers departing Yokosuka Naval Base in August 1945 traded whispers of deprivation. They had grown up on propaganda films that mocked the United States as a nation still shackled by the Great Depression, a society of breadlines and jobless crowds. The same films warned that America's supposed abundance was a mirage. Behind the facade, citizens queued for scraps. To men already weakened by years of cutbacks, the thought of crossing the ocean into hostile hands summoned only dread. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, a former prime minister, had long warned that Japan's resource base was too fragile to sustain total war. By 1945, his prediction was visible in every canteen. Soldiers counted grains of rice rather than bullets. General Homa Masaharu, remembered for his role in the Philippines, had once commanded forces with confidence, but his men now marched on empty stomachs. Even lower-ranking sailors like Petty Officer Taro Kondo, waiting among the surrendered at Yokosuka, could measure the collapse of the empire not in strategy, but in calories. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The average rice ration for a Japanese soldier had fallen to roughly 300–400 grams per day by 1945. Urban nutrition surveys reported deficits of 15–20% below the minimum needed for sustained health. Some garrisons cut rations further, substituting millet or barley. Troops stationed far from supply centers relied on sweet potatoes, often boiled without seasoning. At the same time, civilians at home lined up for their meager allocations. In Tokyo, mothers queued from dawn for soybeans or a clutch of greens. The state exhorted citizens to fight on with slogans about 100 million dying together. But the more immediate reality was 100 million struggling to eat. Against this backdrop, the idea of captivity in the United States seemed terrifying. If civilians in America supposedly relied on ration books, what chance did enemy soldiers have? Rationing headlines did circulate across the Pacific. Meatless Tuesdays, sugar stamps, black market coffee. Japanese interpreters twisted these stories into proof that America was starving too. Few knew that rationing in the U.S. had more to do with shipping priorities and equitable distribution than actual shortage. The petty officer's grim prediction, "Even prisoners will die of hunger," fit neatly with what every Japanese soldier had been taught, that capture meant humiliation, and humiliation meant neglect. The irony, of course, lay in the comparison. By war's end, the United States had processed over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, mostly Germans and Italians, across hundreds of camps. Of these, only about 3,905,000 were Japanese, arriving primarily after surrender in 1945–46. Their small numbers meant they would never overwhelm the system. More striking still was the scale of American provisioning. A standard U.S. field ration for soldiers in the European or Pacific theaters delivered around 3,700 calories per day. Even training base rations at home averaged 3,200, 3,500 calories. Compared with Japanese frontline soldiers surviving on fewer than 2,000 calories daily, the contrast was staggering. This disparity was not accidental. The United States possessed both agricultural land and mechanization that Japan could not match. American wheat fields stretched horizon to horizon, harvested by tractors running on cheap fuel. Japan's plots, fragmented and dependent on manual labor, collapsed once shipping lanes were cut and fertilizer imports ceased. For the men at Yokosuka Naval Base, the first stage was surrender processing, rifles stacked and names recorded. From there, some would be sent to Sugamo Prison in Tokyo before transfer across the Pacific. Guards reminded them of the Geneva Convention. Few understood what that meant, and fewer believed it. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War required food equal in quantity and quality to that issued to depot troops of the detaining power. There was no fixed calorie guarantee, but the principle was clear. A Japanese POW in Texas would eat what an American base private ate in Texas. To men who had last eaten watery millet, the standard was almost unimaginable. Japanese Ministry of Welfare surveys from 1945 confirmed the domestic crisis. Calorie counts in urban Japan fell below subsistence levels. Protein intake dropped to levels normally associated with famine. These official numbers, cross-checked by Allied investigators after surrender, provide the forensic baseline. Japan's army did not exaggerate its hunger. It lived it. The irony is sharp. Men convinced they would waste away under American neglect were, in fact, about to receive better meals than they had known in uniform. Their suffering would not be ignored, but, paradoxically, remedied by the very enemy who had bombed their cities. The ideological weight of this realization would come later. In August 1945, as Petty Officer Taro Kondo stared at the gray hulls in Yokosuka Harbor, the only truth he clung to was hunger. His stomach growled, his nation lay in ruins, and his comrades whispered that captivity was a slow death sentence. None of them yet knew that the clang of the prison gate would mark the beginning of full stomachs, not empty bowls. It is tempting to frame their fear as irrational, but propaganda was powerful, and memories of Japan's own treatment of prisoners colored expectations. What they could not yet grasp was that international law and America's agricultural scale would combine to produce an experience opposite to their fears. The Geneva Convention's promise of equality with U.S. troops, not any mythical 2,000-calorie minimum, set the standard. The first taste of America came not on land, but in a ship's hold, reeking of diesel and with trays of white bread and peaches. For Japanese prisoners captured in 1945, the voyage across the Pacific was the longest and most bewildering journey of their lives. The war had ended in fire and ruin, but their personal war continued inside the steel bellies of American transports. The vessels carrying them were not designed for comfort. Many were Liberty ships, standardized freighters churned out of American yards at astonishing speed. One such ship, the SS John L. Sullivan, had already delivered ammunition to Pacific Islands before being refitted for prisoner transport. Rows of bunks filled the cargo holds, air thick with diesel and salt. Guards patrolled catwalks above, while the prisoners lay packed in hammocks or sat in silence on the deck, trying to steady themselves against the roll of the ocean. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had overseen amphibious operations from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, now directed the larger flow of surrender and repatriation. Under his authority, Japanese officers and enlisted men were loaded aboard convoys bound for the American mainland. Historian and naval officer Lt. Adlard Samuel Eliot Morrison, attached as an official chronicler of the U.S. Navy's crossings. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Jiro Onuma, an airman who had survived the Philippines campaign only to be captured after surrender. His diary, later translated, provides a rare glimpse into the shock and confusion of a Japanese officer suddenly thrust into the hands of an enemy whose reality was far different from propaganda. Speed: Liberty ships averaged 11 knots, a pace steady enough for convoy duty but slow compared to warships. Capacity: typical transports carried 1,500 men, stacked in tiers of bunks. Duration: voyages lasted 2–3 weeks, depending on weather and routing. Diet: Navy rations included canned meat, white bread, and fruit cocktail. Health: some prisoners later recalled gaining weight during the voyage, the first time in years they had eaten until full. Forensic evidence from U.S. Navy provisioning logs shows that ships allotted standard military rations for prisoners. Red Cross observers, occasionally permitted to inspect, noted compliance with international standards. Onuma's diary described astonishment the first time he bit into a slice of American white bread. It was soft, unlike the dense barley loaves served in Japan, and it came accompanied by butter. Then came canned peaches, syrup clinging to the tin. "I did not believe this was possible," he wrote. "The enemy gives us fruit, sweet as summer." To men accustomed to millet, dried sardines, or watery rice, the sensation was almost disorienting. The prisoners traded bites, passing tins down the line so each could taste. Some whispered suspicions that the food was poisoned, an old fear instilled by Japanese training. But when no one sickened, suspicion turned to stunned silence. At home, their families struggled with substitute diets. Rice paddies had been stripped, fertilizers cut off, and shipments blockaded. A Tokyo family might subsist on barley, potatoes, and a few grams of dried fish. Soldiers recalled gnawing hard lumps of millet boiled without seasoning. Now, in the belly of their captor's ship, they were offered spam fried with potatoes, canned beans, and tins of fruit cocktail that glittered in the electric light. The comparison could not have been sharper. A nation on the verge of famine against an enemy whose freighters carried mountains of food, even for their captives. Yet abundance did not erase misery. Seasickness swept through the crowded holds. Men vomited into buckets as diesel fumes clung to the air. Fresh water was rationed carefully. Guards enforced discipline, and barbed wire separated prisoners from crew. Conversations were muted, broken by coughs and the clatter of trays. Some POWs attempted to keep journals. Others simply shut their eyes and prayed that the voyage would end quickly. Still, each mealtime carried its own shock. Prisoners began to notice that portions were not shrinking. The bread came again, the spam again, and more fruit. Onuma wrote of comrades who gained visible weight in less than 3 weeks, a phenomenon almost unimaginable after years of malnutrition. Navy provisioning logs confirmed that prisoner diets on board were nearly identical to those of U.S. enlisted sailors, roughly 3,000 calories per day, adjusted for available supplies. Red Cross reports filed after arrival at Angel Island, the processing station in San Francisco Bay, recorded that prisoners showed no signs of starvation or deliberate mistreatment during transport. The fog of San Francisco Bay greeted them after weeks at sea. Angel Island, once a quarantine and immigration station, now served as the first stop for Japanese prisoners arriving on the mainland. Here they were medically examined, deloused, and assigned to inland camps. Many expected the abundance to end here, assuming the voyage had been a brief exception. Instead, as they would discover, the camp gates opened onto mess halls filled with more of the same: meat, bread, milk, and fruit. The irony was bitter. The first experience of American prosperity for these men came not in victory or freedom, but in captivity. They were locked behind steel bulkheads, watched by armed guards, yet fed more generously than their own soldiers had been in the Emperor's service. The voyage across the Pacific was not merely a transfer of bodies, it was the first fracture in a worldview built on propaganda and deprivation. Onuma, closing his diary one night as the ship rolled in mid-ocean, noted the strangeness of eating to satiety while wearing a prison tag on his uniform. He had expected starvation. Instead, he wrote, "My stomach is full." A Japanese prisoner later recalled, "We expected starvation. Instead, we smelled meat." The sound was heavy, metallic, final, an unmistakable marker that their war was over. For many, This was the first moment captivity became real. Surrender aboard ships still felt temporary. Confinement in an inland American camp signaled permanence. The journey inland carried its own disorientation. Prisoners who had landed at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay were loaded onto trains under military guard. Windows were shuttered, but glimpses of wide plains and farmsteads slipped through cracks. The distances were enormous. Days of travel across deserts, forests, and endless wheat fields. For men raised on a crowded archipelago, the scale of the continent itself was a shock. Their destinations were scattered across the American interior. Two of the most significant were Camp Huntsville in Texas and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The former sat in rolling pine country built to hold around 4,800 prisoners. The latter sprawled across the Midwest, its wooden barracks sturdy against winter snow. At Huntsville, the commandant was Colonel Joseph W. Scobie, an officer trained to enforce discipline with firmness but also to abide by the Geneva Convention. His guards included men like Sergeant Harold Jensen, a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen an enemy Japanese soldier until the gates opened that summer. Among the prisoners was Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, then a young army physician. He would survive captivity to become one of Japan's most respected doctors in the post-war era, but in 1945 he entered the camp as another anonymous figure in fatigues, clutching a duffel and a gnawing uncertainty. At its peak, the United States housed about 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, most of them German or Italian. The Japanese share was small, roughly 3,900 to 5,000 men, scattered among camps rather than concentrated. Huntsville's capacity of 4,800 meant the camp could hold the entire Japanese contingent several times over. The U.S. Army allocated 2,300 calories per day to base troops, and by law, POWs received the same. Feeding a prisoner cost about $1.50 per day in 1944, a sum that startled many civilians who rationed butter and sugar at home. These figures came directly from Army Service Forces ration tables, meticulous ledgers that showed not only calories, but pounds of beef, gallons of milk, and bushels of potatoes distributed each week. When the gates shut behind them, the Japanese prisoners braced for neglect. Barbed wire glinted in the sun, towers loomed with armed MPs, and dust clung to their boots. The camps bore the look of prisons, fences, watchtowers, floodlights, but not the feel of starvation. Mess halls were among the first buildings they entered. Long lines formed, trays in hand. What awaited them was not gruel, but full army meals: meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, sometimes even dessert. The shock registered immediately. One POW later remembered thinking, "We thought it was a trick." German POWs, who made up the vast majority of the prisoner population, had already grown accustomed to these meals. They ate heartily, joked with guards, and occasionally complained about seasoning. For the Japanese, the cultural and psychological gap was enormous. Many still half-expected deliberate starvation. Where Germans saw the food as decent but routine, Japanese soldiers saw it as a revelation. Milk, a daily ration item in U.S. camps, had been nearly absent from their diets in Japan. Fresh bread appeared in endless loaves. Fruit, apples, oranges, bananas, when available, seemed miraculous. The quality of rations was deliberate. By law and policy, there were no starvation camps. Colonel Scobie understood his duty extended beyond confinement. Geneva rules required adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Sergeants like Harold Jensen enforced discipline with patrols, inspections, and curfews, but they also witnessed firsthand the disbelief on Japanese faces when trays filled with beef stew or scrambled eggs. Work details began soon after arrival. Prisoners cleaned barracks, maintained campgrounds, and prepared for eventual agricultural labor. But food remained the central marker of their new existence. For men accustomed to empty stomachs, the mess hall schedule became the day's defining rhythm. Army Service Forces ration records confirmed the consistency of these meals. Tables list allocations down to fractions of ounces per soldier or prisoner, pounds of beef per 100 men, quarts of milk per company, cans of fruit per week. Nothing was arbitrary. Even in Texas, supply trucks rolled in daily with crates and barrels, ensuring POWs ate as well as the GIs training on nearby bases. For Japanese soldiers raised under the code of Bushido, the shock ran deeper than food. They had been taught that capture was shameful, that an enemy would treat them with contempt, yet here was the United States, feeding them not just enough to live, but enough to thrive. Some responded with gratitude, others with suspicion. Hinohara later recalled that at first he wondered if the generous rations were a prelude to some hidden cruelty. But weeks passed, and the meals continued without change. Gradually, suspicion gave way to a dawning awareness. The enemy intended to keep them alive, not to let them wither. Post-war rumors sometimes claimed the U.S. operated starvation camps for Japanese POWs. The record shows otherwise. Geneva Convention compliance was strict, and with such a small number of Japanese prisoners, the logistical burden was light. Conditions varied from camp to camp, but in no case did deliberate starvation occur. The deepest irony lay in contrast to their training. These men had been taught to charge tanks with bayonets, to leap from cliffs rather than surrender, to choose hunger and death over dishonor. Yet here, surrounded by barbed wire, they were being kept alive by the beef and bread of their enemy. The clang of the camp gates in Texas and Wisconsin signaled captivity but also survival. In the very heart of America, under armed guard, Japanese soldiers found their first assurance of full stomachs since the war began. What they expected as a sentence of hunger became, paradoxically, their reprieve from it. In 1944, U.S. beef production exceeded 24 billion pounds, enough to dwarf Japan's wartime output. The statistic alone explains part of the chasm between captor and captive. For Japanese prisoners in America, the difference was not an abstraction. It was ladled daily onto their trays. Each camp's heart was the mess hall. Long wooden tables, rows of steel trays, the clatter of utensils, these were the sounds of captivity. Yet for men who expected starvation, the halls felt less like prisons than like warehouses of plenty. At Camp Huntsville in Texas and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, meals followed the rhythm of the U.S. Army. Guards lined prisoners into queues, but once trays were filled, the atmosphere relaxed into murmurs and astonished whispers. Prisoners ate in near silence the first weeks, bewildered by the abundance. The menus rotated. Breakfast might bring scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch could be stew with beef and potatoes. Dinner offered meatloaf or fried chicken with vegetables and bread. Dessert? Canned fruit cocktail or pudding. Arrived more often than they could believe. Behind these meals lay the machinery of the American war economy. Claude Wickard, Secretary of Agriculture, oversaw an agricultural sector that continued to expand, even while millions of men served overseas. General Breon B. Somervell, head of the Army Service Forces, ensured supplies moved seamlessly from Midwest stockyards to camp kitchens. And within the wire, prisoner leaders like Captain Ichiro Suzuki acted as intermediaries, translating orders and calming suspicions among fellow Japanese. The Quartermaster Corps handled logistics, drawing on the vast output of the Department of Agriculture. Their reports cataloged the tonnage of beef, flour, sugar, and milk distributed each month. Where Japan fought a losing battle against blockade and crop failure, America's challenge was storing, shipping, and distributing its agricultural surpluses. Prisoners were regularly served meat, potatoes, bread, and canned fruit. Health surveys noted that many gained several kilograms within months, a rare wartime instance of weight gain. The U.S. civilians, even under rationing, maintained about 3,000 calories per day. Japan by 1945 often failed to provide 2,000 calories daily for soldiers or civilians. Army ration plans frequently included milk, nearly absent from Japanese diets. Forensic evidence from Quartermaster Corps ration reports and USDA wartime statistics confirmed the scale. Food never ceased flowing to the camps. One diary entry captured the shock bluntly: "We eat like generals." The line, preserved in translation, spoke volumes. Back home, even high-ranking officers could not command such fare by 1945. For enlisted men now confined in Texas or Wisconsin, the irony was sharper still. The emperor's uniform had delivered hunger, captivity delivered meat. The contrast between American and Japanese agriculture could not have been greater. In the U.S.'s mechanization and scale defined the harvest. By 1944, more than 1 million farms were mechanized, tractors and combines roaring across fields. Wartime mobilization pulled men into factories and armies, yet crop yields still rose, aided by fertilizer and machinery. Japan, by contrast, had relied heavily on imports of soybeans, wheat, and rice from Manchuria, Korea, and Southeast Asia. By 1945, Allied blockades and bombing had severed these arteries. Harvests shrank, fertilizers vanished, and caloric intake collapsed. Mothers watered down rice porridge. Children went without protein for weeks. Thus, at every mealtime, prisoners tasted not only food, but the broader outcome of industrial war. It is tempting to imagine POWs feasting daily on banquets. The truth was less dramatic but still extraordinary. They received army-sandaled meals, nothing more, nothing less. For American soldiers, the food was routine, sometimes bland, sometimes monotonous. For Japanese POWs, however, the same tray was a marvel. The gap lay not in extravagance, but in perspective. The Army's cost accounting reinforces the point. At $1.50 per POW per day in 1944, the meals were designed for efficiency, not luxury. But to men who had last eaten a thin gruel of barley, efficiency looked like decadence. One detail stood out repeatedly in memoirs: milk. To Japanese soldiers, fresh milk was virtually unknown, reserved in pre-war years for children or the sick. In Texas, they were handed pints of it with breakfast. Some gagged at the unfamiliar taste, others grew to cherish it. Nutritionists later observed that calcium and protein intake among prisoners far exceeded pre-capture levels, contributing to visible health improvements. Food carried symbolic weight beyond nutrition. Every tray reinforced the failure of wartime propaganda. Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans were weak, poor, and incapable of endurance. Yet here they were, facing the daily evidence of an enemy whose abundance extended even to its captives. Captain Ichiro Suzuki struggled to explain the paradox to his men. In nightly meetings, he reminded them that food was not kindness, but regulation. Still, the message eroded. Some men admitted, quietly, that they no longer believed everything the imperial government had told them. The data is unambiguous. Quartermaster reports list caloric content and portion sizes. USDA bulletins confirm production totals. Together, they prove that POW diets matched U.S. Army base standards. Health records compiled at camps recorded weight gain, improved blood counts, and reduced illness. This evidence undermines later claims that Japanese POWs were deliberately underfed. The records show parity with American soldiers in the same region. The greatest irony of all was that defeat provided nourishment victory never could. For many Japanese POWs, captivity marked the healthiest months of their wartime lives. They ate 3 full meals a day, consumed meat regularly, drank milk, and tasted fruit, far beyond Japan's wartime capacity. In quiet moments, some admitted it aloud. Never before had they eaten so well. A soldier who once swore he would never be captured now admitted that bread and beef had saved him. The clang of the gates had signaled imprisonment. The mess hall clatter of trays and ladles signaled something stranger. Survival through abundance. The first time steamed rice was served in a Texas camp, the cheers shook the barracks. For weeks, the prisoners had endured trays of bread, potatoes, and meat, plenty by any measure, but alien to their palates. Then one morning, cooks announced a special delivery. Bags of rice had arrived from a War Relocation Authority warehouse, and camp kitchens steamed it by the gallon. When the grains appeared on trays, men clapped, shouted, and wept. For the first time in captivity, the taste of home returned. But rice was the exception. Day after day, Japanese POWs encountered the staples of American kitchens: Spam, white bread, and coffee. Spam in particular confounded them. Shaped into neat, pink blocks, salty and greasy, it bore no resemblance to dried fish or rice balls. At first, some refused to touch it, others tried it cautiously, then reached for second helpings. In letters home, guards described the odd spectacle of men begging for it the next. Bread was another shock. In Japan, bread was a rare treat, often hard rolls or imported loaves. Here, camp bakeries turned out hundreds of loaves daily, fluffy and white, with crusts soft enough to tear by hand. Many POWs left their crusts uneaten, baffled by texture and taste. German prisoners, by contrast, devoured every slice, delighted by the abundance. The contrast was stark. Bread that satisfied Germans puzzled the Japanese, who longed for rice. Among the Japanese at Camp Kuniti in Texas was Dr. Kazuo Sakamaki, the very first Japanese prisoner captured by the U.S. in December 1941 after the failed Pearl Harbor midget submarine attack. 4 years later, he found himself eating army bread and Spam. His mere presence embodied the arc of the war, from daring attack to resigned captivity, from secrecy to open mess hall lines. Guard duty at Kennedy fell to men like Private Harold P. Smith, a young Texan who wrote letters home about the surreal sight of former enemies sipping coffee in the camp yard. "They line up every morning for the steaming stuff," he wrote, "and make faces like it's poison. Then they drink 3 cups. Historians later mined these records for insight. Professor John Dower, whose studies of the Pacific War explored race and perception, cited such testimonies as evidence of how cultural misunderstanding could collapse under the weight of daily routine, food as common ground breaking through propaganda. Rice was occasionally procured through government warehouses, but never daily. Coffee appeared every morning, brewed in gallons. Most prisoners had never tasted it before. Canteens sold candy, cigarettes, and soda, bought with POW wages earned from work details. Camp bakeries produced hundreds of loaves daily, ensuring bread on every tray. Work detachments received portable lunches, sandwiches, fruit, sometimes cake, when sent outside camp fences. Forensic evidence from Camp Kennedy kitchen logs confirms both scale and consistency. Oral histories collected decades later match the numbers. Bread in abundance, rice rare, coffee constant. The canteen became another frontier of culture shock. POWs spent their wages, 80 cents a day in camp coupons, on candy bars, bottled soda, and cigarettes. For men who had left a nation where sugar and tobacco were scarce luxuries, the camp store felt like a glimpse into another world. Some gorged on chocolate until their stomachs rebelled. Others carefully saved cigarettes, knowing they had trade value among comrades. Lunches for outside work detachments drew more commentary. Instead of rice balls wrapped in seaweed, POWs were handed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, with slices of meat, lettuce, and mustard. Many examined them with suspicion, peeling apart the layers, then ate cautiously. By the end of the first summer, even skeptics were asking for extra. The cultural divide grew sharper in comparison. German POWs welcomed bread with enthusiasm. They praised camp bakeries, often volunteering to help. Some said the loaves reminded them of pre-war abundance in Europe. Japanese POWs, by contrast, left crusts behind or asked guards if rice might return. This small but telling detail revealed how food underscored deeper differences: Germany's tradition of bread as staple versus Japan's reliance on rice as cultural bedrock. One Japanese POW, decades later, distilled the experience simply: bread was strange, but fruit was paradise. Canned peaches and fruit cocktail, in particular, became objects of fascination. Men wrote in diaries about the sweetness, so far removed from wartime rations of pickled plums or potato broth. To taste peaches every week was to taste something they never imagined possible in defeat. Coffee deserves special mention. Almost no Japanese soldiers had encountered it before. The bitter, dark drink shocked them at first. Many spat it out, others grimaced, but curiosity persisted. Soon, as Private Smith observed, they lined up for refills. Some later admitted they came to like it, especially with sugar. Coffee became a symbol of adaptation, an alien flavor that gradually became a daily ritual. The records at Camp Kennedy show procurement of rice shipments when available, allocation of bread in the hundreds of loaves per day, and purchase orders for coffee, sugar, and fruit tins. Oral histories gathered from former POWs confirm both the novelty and the adjustment process. The irony was unavoidable. These were men who had once sworn to die rather than be captured. They had shouted "Tenno Heika Banzai" in battle and braced for starvation in captivity. Yet now they found themselves giggling at soda bottles, bartering candy bars, and writing in diaries about the sweetness of American peaches. In the mess halls of Texas, captivity softened into survival, even small joy. Food did what speeches could not. It stripped propaganda of its power. A soldier who once believed Americans were cruel barbarians now sipped coffee and realized his enemies had given him not death, but dessert. "We feed you better than the Emperor did," a U.S. guard teased one afternoon, passing trays of stew down the mess line. The remark stung. Years later, a former prisoner would record it in his diary, not for cruelty, but for the truth it revealed. For years, Japanese soldiers had been taught that America was a nation in decline, weak and desperate. State-controlled films showed images of Depression-era breadlines, interpreted as proof that the enemy could not feed its own people. Military indoctrination warned that American cruelty toward prisoners was certain and that capture meant starvation or execution. But day after day, behind barbed wire in Texas, Wisconsin, or Arkansas, these stories collapsed. Mess halls overflowed with food, not queues of the hungry. Guards enforced order, but not starvation. Captivity, meant to be their undoing, became the first time many ate regularly in years. The collapse of propaganda was personified in individuals. Hideki Tojo, wartime prime minister, had promised his nation that America would crumble under blockade and rationing. Yet evidence inside U.S. camps proved otherwise. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Ringel, a naval intelligence officer, studied POW reactions closely. He wrote reports for the War Department's Psychological Warfare Branch, noting that Japanese prisoners expressed shock at American abundance. Ringel argued that such experiences undermined enemy morale more effectively than leaflets or broadcasts. Inside the wire, figures like Lieutenant Hiroshi Arakawa, once a confident officer, admitted privately to comrades that the enemy's wealth and organization were undeniable. His admission carried the weight of betrayal, not against Japan, but against illusions drilled into him since academy days. The gulf in production was staggering. By 1945, Japan imported less than 10% of its pre-war food supply, the rest severed by Allied blockade. Meanwhile, the U.S. churned out billions of cans of fruit and vegetables annually, ensuring not only soldiers but even prisoners had variety. Over 1 million American farms were mechanized during the war, tractors and combines multiplying yields. Japanese civilians by late 1945 suffered a deficit of 400–600 calories per day, according to Ministry of Welfare surveys. POW medical surveys in the U.S. recorded measurable health improvement, weight gain, stronger blood counts, after only months in custody. The figures spoke a language propaganda could not twist. Reports from the Office of War Information, OWI, compared captured Japanese accounts with pre-war indoctrination. Analysts highlighted the disbelief expressed in interrogations doctrine pin. POWs confessed they had expected hunger only to encounter abundance. These records, dry in tone, carry forensic clarity, propaganda myths collapsing under the weight of evidence. One Japanese officer captured in 1945 told interrogators bluntly, "We believed America was starving. Now we see you have too much food." His statement, preserved in intelligence files, is echoed in diaries and oral histories. For men raised to see themselves as heirs of a divine empire, the realization that the enemy out-suppressed and outfed them was devastating. The most striking contrast came in imagery. Japanese films of the 1930s had replayed images of American breadlines, silent rows of men waiting for soup in Depression winters. But inside U.S. camps, prisoners lined up before mess halls that served overflowing trays of bread, meat, and fruit. The contradiction was undeniable. What had been presented as truth was now exposed as theater. Later memoirs sometimes exaggerated the comfort, describing POW camps as luxury resorts. Reality was more restrained. Camps were ringed with barbed wire, patrolled by guards, and governed by strict discipline. Prisoners worked in fields and factories, slept in crowded barracks, and endured the loneliness of exile. The meals, though abundant, followed Army standard rations, nutritious but hardly lavish. The truth lay in perspective. To an American soldier, a tray of stew and potatoes was routine. To a Japanese prisoner, it was a banquet compared to millet and watery soup. The distinction matters. The ultimate irony was simple. Propaganda did not collapse in fiery speeches or courtroom confessions. It died at mealtimes, one bite at a time. A spoonful of peaches and syrup carried more weight than any leaflet dropped from the sky. Prisoners realized the empire had lied to them, not through argument, but through dessert. Lieutenant Arakawa scribbled in his diary one evening, "They told us America was poor, but here even prisoners eat like kings." For him and thousands of others, the war's most disorienting revelation came not in battle, but in the quiet clatter of trays in a Texas mess hall. The clang of shovels echoed as POWs labored in cotton fields for camp-issued coupons. Bent backs under a Texas sun marked one of the strangest ironies of the war, enemy soldiers cultivating the food of their captors, then eating better than their own families back home. By 1943, the War Department faced a labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas, yet the home front needed hands for harvests, logging camps, and factories. The solution was pragmatic: put prisoners to work. Under the Department of Labor's guidelines, Axis POWs were dispatched to farms and forestry projects. They worked under guard, but with the protection of the Geneva Convention, which allowed prisoner labor so long as it was not directly tied to war production. Japanese POWs were a small minority, barely a few thousand among hundreds of thousands of Germans and Italians, but they too joined the detachments. Trucks rolled out of camp gates before dawn, carrying men in fatigue uniforms to cotton fields, sawmills, and orchards. At the policy level, General Allen W. Gullion oversaw the Army's Provost Marshal General's office, which managed POW employment. His circulars spelled out wage rules, meal standards, and working conditions. On the ground, men like Henry Bell, a Texas farmer, contracted with the government for POW labor. Bell remembered the shock of seeing Japanese men hoeing rows of cotton on his land. They worked hard, he said, though silently, and were returned to camp each evening. Among the laborers was Sergeant Noboru Sato, a captured infantryman. He wrote in a letter preserved after the war, We plow fields, then eat better than our families in Japan. POWs often worked full farm days, sunrise to dusk, 6 days a week. They were credited about $0.80 per day in camp coupons, not cash, redeemable at canteens for cigarettes, candy, or small goods. Nationwide, POWs contributed millions of man-hours, easing labor shortages in agriculture. Field lunches typically included bread, meat, and fruit, packed in wax paper. Coupons could purchase cigarettes, chocolate, and soda at camp canteens, luxuries unimaginable back home. Forensic evidence from War Department POW labor records confirms the scale of the program. Farms across Texas, Arkansas, and the Midwest submitted receipts for POW crews with wages set by federal regulation. The routine was punishing by American standards, but not unfamiliar to men from rural Japan. Prisoners swung hoes, cut timber, and picked crops in teams under MP's supervision. At midday, they paused for their field lunches. Sato remembered peeling open a sandwich, 2 slices of bread, a slab of meat, a slice of fruit wrapped in paper, and marveling at the convenience. Such packaging, he admitted later, felt like a symbol of America's efficiency. After work, trucks returned the prisoners to camp. There, their coupons could be exchanged at the canteen. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, and bottled sodas lined the shelves, all sold at fixed prices. For many, this was the first taste of consumer America, a market economy shrunk to the scale of a prison store. The irony extended beyond camp fences. American soldiers overseas lived on sea rations, canned meat, crackers, and powdered drink packets, often monotonous and barely palatable. Meanwhile, Japanese POWs inside the United States ate Army base rations, complete with fresh bread and fruit. The comparison was not lost on those who read about their countrymen's experiences in Europe or the Pacific. Some GIs grumbled that enemy prisoners ate better than they did in foxholes. The most telling evidence comes from the prisoners themselves. In one surviving letter, a POW wrote, "We work in the sun but eat well. The food is more than my wife and children will see this year." Censors allowed such passages through, perhaps deliberately, as they revealed nothing of military value but everything about the psychological shock of captivity. Others recorded the dissonance in diaries, toil by day, but candy bars by night. The disorienting mixture of hardship and indulgence cracked the cultural image of America as a weak or decadent society. The War Department's POW labor ledgers offer a paper trail as clear as any battle map. They record the hours worked, wages paid, and deductions for canteen purchases. They also note camp medical inspections, which found that men engaged in regular agricultural labor maintained or improved weight thanks to calorie-rich diets. Here lay the final twist. Captivity became a window into the very consumer society Japanese propaganda had dismissed. Prisoners who once marched, shouting "death before dishonor," now debated which soda to buy with coupons. They smoked Lucky Strikes, chewed American candy, and carried sandwiches into cotton rows. None of it erased the humiliation of defeat, but the clang of shovels and the crinkle of candy wrappers left memories that endured. For some, the taste of chocolate or the fizz of soda was more shocking than the sight of barbed wire. Work detachments were designed to extract labor from idle prisoners to balance America's manpower shortages. Instead, they revealed a paradox. Men captured as enemies of democracy were introduced to its consumer comforts through wages and canteens. Enemy soldiers, sweating in American fields, tasted not just the bread and fruit of survival but the paradoxical sweetness of a society that could afford to feed its foes. Disembarking at Yokohama, former POWs smelled hunger in the ashes of home. The harbor, once bustling with merchant ships, now reeked of seaweed, coal smoke, and something more intangible: famine. Behind the docks lay a flattened cityscape where brick shells and scorched timbers stood in place of markets. Men who had survived captivity in Texas or Wisconsin now faced the harsher reality of freedom in Japan. From late 1945 through 1947, Japanese prisoners of war were repatriated in waves under the oversight of Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, CAP, General Douglas MacArthur, supreme authority in occupied Japan, ordered the systematic return of tens of thousands held across the Pacific. For Japanese officials like Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru, freshly released from prison himself after surrender, each ship unloading at Yokohama docks was both a symbol of humiliation and a logistical crisis. Mouths to feed in a starving nation. One of the men to step ashore was Koichi Nakagawa, a young infantryman captured in 1945 and sent to an American camp. His memories illustrate the dissonance of the moment. In captivity, Nakagawa had worked fields, eaten bread and fruit, and even tasted chocolate. In Yokohama, he smelled hunger before he saw it. The data paints the bleak picture. Post-war civilian rations fell to about 1,800 calories per day, often below the threshold for sustained health. In cities like Tokyo and Osaka, allocations sometimes dipped near 1,000 calories per day, and black markets became the only supplement. Between 1946 and 1947, tens of thousands died of hunger and malnutrition, particularly the elderly and children. The U.S. sought to stabilize conditions with emergency shipments. Millions of tons of wheat, soybeans, and powdered milk crossed the Pacific under occupation relief programs. SCAP surveys confirmed widespread nutritional decline, documenting cases of vitamin deficiencies and stunted growth. SCAP nutrition surveys and repatriation logs from Yokohama confirmed the grim balance. Returning prisoners often appeared healthier than civilians who had never left Japan. Medical officers noted higher body weights, fewer signs of malnutrition, and in some cases better dental condition than the general population. The evidence was as stark as the ruins themselves. Nakagawa's own words echoed in oral history decades later. "We lived better in captivity than at home." It was a confession tinged with guilt. He had eaten American beef stew while his wife boiled millet gruel for their children. The irony was unbearable. Surrender had fed him, while loyalty had starved his family. The contrast between American shipments and Japan's ruined agriculture was overwhelming. U.S. cargoes of surplus grain, stacked in white sacks marked "Gift of the American People," poured into Japan's ports. Wheat flour was distributed to bakeries to produce unfamiliar but filling loaves of bread. Meanwhile, Japan's fields lay in tatters. Bombing raids had destroyed irrigation canals, warehouses, and transport lines. Fertilizer shortages crippled yields. Rice harvests shrank, and rural villages could not feed nearby cities. This juxtaposition left returning POWs in disbelief. They had expected shame in captivity and relief at homecoming. Instead, they found the inverse. Families greeted them with mixed emotions. Relief at survival clashed with envy of their relative health. Some wives admitted shock that their husbands returned heavier than when captured. Neighbors whispered that POWs had lived soft in America, while their countrymen endured firebombings and hunger. The stigma of captivity lingered. In imperial ideology, surrender was dishonor. Yet the visible evidence, sturdy men returning to skeletal families, challenged that belief. It was difficult to call them cowards when their bodies testified to a truth everyone could see. America had fed them better than Japan had fed its own. General MacArthur understood the political danger of famine. His occupation government prioritized food relief not only as humanitarian duty, but as a stabilizing tool. Grain shipments reassured a desperate public, and the very bread loaves baked from American wheat became symbols of a new order. Former POWs, ironically, were among the best equipped to adapt. They had already eaten white bread and Spam in Texas mess halls. Now they guided their families through the strange but sustaining diet of imported flour. Though Japanese leaders seldom spoke openly, their silence was revealing. Officials who had promised victory through self-sacrifice now presided over soup lines and ration queues. Farmers who once shouted patriotic slogans now hid surplus rice from tax collectors. For repatriated POWs, the hypocrisy was plain. The empire that urged them to fight to the death had collapsed, while the enemy that captured them had kept them alive. The irony cut deep. Men who had crossed the Pacific in chains now stepped ashore healthier than those who had never left. They had feared starvation under foreign guards, and instead found it awaiting them in their own neighborhoods. Nakagawa later admitted to a friend, "In America, I ate peaches from a tin. At home, my children ate grass boiled in water." The image lingers, syrupy fruit behind barbed wire versus bitter weeds in freedom. Repatriation was supposed to mark closure. Instead, it revealed the collapse of an entire worldview. The emperor's armies had promised glory through endurance, but glory could not fill empty stomachs. Captivity had saved lives, while loyalty to the nation left graves. On Yokohama's docks, as ships unloaded thousands of returned men, the paradox became visible. Survival had been secured abroad, not at home. By 1950, American food aid had delivered millions of tons of wheat and rice to Japan. The numbers alone tell a story. A nation that once fought to annihilation was being fed by the very power it had sworn to destroy. But beyond tonnage and rations, the legacy of that food lay in memory, in the diaries of prisoners, in testimonies at tribunals, and in the long shadow of reconciliation. The end of war had not ended hunger. Japan's fields, scorched by bombing and stripped of imports, could not sustain its population. Between 1946 and 1952, millions of tons of American wheat, soy, and rice crossed the Pacific under relief programs. Bread, noodles, and soy-based foods became staples of the new diet. For former prisoners of war, the irony was sharp. The enemy that had captured them continued to feed them, this time as civilians, not soldiers. The mess halls of Texas had been replaced by distribution centers in Tokyo, but the taste of American flour and canned goods was familiar. Medical leaders noted the transformation. U.S. Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk tracked health data showing steep declines in mortality rates by 1950, thanks in part to improved nutrition. Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, once a POW in America, became a prominent physician in post-war Japan. His own survival, aided by American rations, underscored the role of food in medicine and public health. Even Emperor Hirohito, who had once exhorted his people to sacrifice, now presided over an empire rebuilt on bread made from American wheat. Photographs captured him touring schools where children drank reconstituted milk supplied by occupation authorities. He said, "Milk is the meat of our Aunt Annie." Millions of tons of food aid flowed between 1946 and 1952 under U.S.M. international programs. Mortality rates declined sharply by 1950, with infant and child health improving most. Thousands of POW testimonies were collected by scholars and archivists by the 1,970s. Occupation. Food expenditures ran into tens of millions of dollars, a fraction of the war budget, but transformative for survival. Several camps, including Huntsville and McCoy, have since preserved museums or memorials to this history. Records from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal included testimony on treatment of prisoners, contrasting Axis brutality with Allied adherence to Geneva standards. SCAP reports documented nutrition surveys and the distribution of aid. The International Red Cross preserved archives of inspections and post-war relief operations. Together, these sources offer a forensic trail linking wartime captivity to post-war humanitarian policy. One former POW summarized his journey in a single sentence: "I hated America. Then I tasted America. Food did not erase grief or humiliation, but it dismantled myths and created new perceptions." Prisoners who had once cursed their captors began to see them as providers. Decades later, Oral histories collected across Japan returned to the same theme: shock at abundance and gratitude for survival. German POWs in the U.S. also remembered fair treatment. Many farmed, ate well, and returned home healthy. But the shock was different for the Japanese. Germans had not expected starvation. They had expected parity with America. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, had been conditioned to believe in American weakness. Their astonishment lay in the sheer abundance: fruit, bread, milk, foods beyond reach even for officers at home. In later decades, parts of the POW system were preserved. Camp Huntsville created exhibits recalling its wartime history. Camp McCoy incorporated POW stories into its museum displays. Oral histories gathered in Texas, Wisconsin, and Japan ensured the memory did not fade. Visitors could read the testimonies of guards and prisoners alike, many echoing the same refrain: disbelief at the food. The irony endures. Food, the most basic human need, became the first bridge between enemies. Bombs had destroyed cities, and propaganda had poisoned minds. But bread and peaches built a small space of common ground. Former POWs who lived into the 1970s and 1980s often told their grandchildren less about battles and more about meals. The strangeness of Spam, the sweetness of fruit cocktail, the shock of milk. This memory mattered beyond sentiment. It shaped post-war relations. American officials pointed to POW treatment as evidence of democratic values. Japanese veterans, recalling how they had been fed, found it harder to demonize their former captors. By 1950, hunger in Japan was easing, and the nation's economy was beginning to revive. Yet the memory of starvation and the contrast with captivity remained etched into personal histories. The war had been fought with slogans of death before surrender. Yet, surrender had preserved life. In courtrooms, classrooms, and kitchens, the legacy of POW meals lingered. It was not battleships or bombers that softened hostility, but loaves of bread, tins of peaches, and gallons of milk. The men who once expected to die of hunger in America discovered that survival had come in the form of food shared by their captors. And in that irony lay the seed of reconciliation. Nourishment as the first act of peace.